Hello, I'm Todd Johnson, and this is Earlylands in Conversation. 2026 has started with a proverbial bang, with the hard realities of military force brought squarely into the headlines with the U.S. operation to seize Nicholas Maduro. And, of course, the grinding war of attrition continues in Ukraine, as do conflicts in countries as varied as Sudan and Myanmar. Our guest today argues that the reality of modern war remains very similar to what was experienced by infantrymen throughout the conflicts of the 20th century and even centuries before. Ben Connable is the author of the recently published book, Ground Combat: Puncturing the Myths of Modern War. The book serves as a compelling argument against any belief that conflict is now more about joysticks and video screens than it is about the deprivation, fear, and uncertainty that have been associated with war since time immemorial. Ben, who holds a PhD in war studies from King's College London, is the executive director of the Battle Research Group. He is also an adjunct professor of security studies at Georgetown University and a former senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. Ben is also a retired Marine Corps intelligence and Middle East foreign area officer. We are pleased to welcome Ben Connable to Earlylands in Conversation. And, of course, if you enjoyed this and our other episodes, please like and subscribe. Ben, thank you very much for joining us today. Where are we catching you at?
I'm in Arlington, Virginia.
Let's jump straight into this. Ben, you've had an unusually and varied professional journey, from a Marine officer to a leading academic and theorist of war. Can you walk us through that trajectory and explain how your operational experiences as a Marine shaped the questions you ultimately set out to answer in the book Ground Combat?
Sure. I actually started out as an enlisted Marine after dropping out of Boston University in 1987. So I worked my way up from private to major, and then I retired. So it's a good lesson in not giving up.
I know. I always like those stories of guys who decided, or at least a period in their life, university wasn't for them, and then they spent some time in the military and then got themselves back into university, and like you, went all the way to PhD. Was it your time in the Marines that sort of set your mind to the fact that, yeah, I actually want to get back to university and actually go all the way to get a doctorate?
Yeah, I think it's important when you undertake an education to have a reason to do it. And when I
Right.
was, when I was 18, 19, I didn't have a reason.
I know you're not the only person, my friend.
Yeah, right. I mean, I left because I didn't want to be there. I wanted to be in service.
Right.
So it was less giving up, is more redirecting, and found what I wanted. And I love the Marine Corps. And then the education was both a pursuit to help me just improve myself professionally, but also because I found it fascinating, and everything that I studied directly contributed to the work that I was doing.
So go back to that about how, particularly your experience as a Marine, set out to sort of point you in the direction of the questions you tried to answer in the book.
Right. I mean, of course, whenever you write a book, you want to write about things that you know.
Sure.
Right. That's the number one.
That's usually a good recipe.
Yeah. Right. Right. Kind of a trope, but it is very helpful to write about things that you find interesting, and that questions that were raised throughout your life and that you found unanswered. And that's really what this book is. It was getting into the complexities of warfare that I saw both in personal experience, but also learned about from reading extensively throughout the course of my career, and also learning from my superiors and peers and juniors who were able to convey that to me. And there was never a clear answer to the vast majority of problems that you deal with in the military. I mean, there's some very technical, tactical stuff that's satisfying and easy, but
Right.
the vast majority of what we do is sometimes frustrating.
So your central thesis in the book is really pretty strikingly contrarian. At a time when so much analysis of the future of warfare is very technocentric, drones, sensors, cyber, AI, you actually argue that ground combat obeys enduring patterns that, technology rarely overturns. So what is your argument in its clearest form, and why do you think it challenges so many of the dominant assumptions today? I mean, you can't open the Wall Street Journal or Financial Times without an article about defense technology, revolving around AI, not revolving around the combat infantryman. So tell us really what the argument is in the book.
Yeah, it is. It does come across as contrarian, and I get a lot of that, and certainly that's the feedback or the pushback. I would argue instead that it's an effort to return us or bring us to a more connected reality, and to tie
Sure.
the real world experience of warfare with policy. So yeah, it is absolutely true that the kind of zeitgeist now is, we're going to win with technology, and that all the things that mattered before in warfare have been overturned and are no longer relevant, or at the very least are far less relevant. And if the idea here with this book and with the study is to dig into the evidence, look at what actually is happening around the world, trace the technology over time, and put everything in context. And when you do that, a lot of the kind of more excited arguments today, including ones that are driving technology investment, innovation, strategic insight, and policy, are
Right.
don't stand up. They don't hold up to the evidence.
Tell us about that. I mean, the book, you do a very thorough analysis, decade by decade, from revolution in military affairs, and the antecedents to that. But tell me why it doesn't stand up. Tell us how you got to that conclusion with the amount of data sets that you went through, the sheer number of combat actions that you analyzed.
So the approach was to study war as it is practiced. So I built a database of 423 modern battles that took place in the 21st century. I also have some World War II and Cold War ones for comparison,
Right.
and then dug into those in great detail, um, and built this database. It's online. It's publicly available. And what it showed was an evolutionary change in warfare, not a revolutionary one.
Right.
And so the idea, we can dig right into drones if you want to, but the comparison to the RMA is really important here, right? I mean, it stands in contrast. The evidence stands in contrast to what is a cyclical argument, and the argument is generally that, hey, if we invest in the right technology, if we buy the right things, that we will be able to completely dominate our enemies and will never fear for defeat. So
Right.
those arguments never bear out, and they tend to be more inflated in interwar periods, and I think that's where we are now.
For this 400 plus actions, most of them in the 21st century, mass majority of those, most of us will have never heard of, right? So what were your primary sources? And were you saying, how long, the intensity of the action, or the number of individuals involved? How did you find these case studies?
Everywhere, online books, engagements. We also have field research out in Ukraine, where I've got a colleague actually who's there right now doing another battle study. So it's a combination of primary and secondary sources, from any source I could obtain,
Right.
and then we coded for everything. So it's a great question. What are we looking at here? And it's everything from who fought, how they fought, what technology they were using, how did they use it, what happened, how long did it take. There are 19 categories of codes. I think there's 350 some odd codes in total,
Right.
to try to get into fidelity and detail here. And you're right in that a lot of these battles take place in Somalia and Sudan, and places that we were not focused on. And one of my main arguments in the book is that, yeah, it seems like these things don't matter, but in fact, they actually do to a significant extent and for a variety of reasons. And I'd be happy to talk about that.
You're catching me just a day after I saw the documentary 2,000 meters to Andreevka,
Yeah,
which
it's a great
if you it's utterly amazing. And boy, ground combat in its most visceral form. Sure, drones make numerous appearances throughout, but that is ground combat in which technology seems to be secondary in many respects, right? I don't know if you've seen that or if you had thoughts on that.
I think it stands in really good contrast with another film that was just released, was actually made in the mid 2000s. I think it's called The Last 600 Meters, and about the Marines and soldiers fighting in Fallujah and Najaf. And you get the same exact perspective, right? That it is grinding,
Grinding, that's right.
brutal, intimate, and violent, and it looks a lot like what combat probably looked like, or actually we know looked like in World War II. That doesn't mean technology doesn't matter. Of course it does, and that it doesn't have a role. Of course it does. It just means that our perspective of the ubiquity and utility of technology is skewed for a variety of reasons, and particularly in Ukraine. And so that documentary is really helpful because it puts front and center the infantry troops that are actually the ones fighting on the ground
Right,
instead of
exactly.
this constant barrage of drone montages, right?
Exactly. Something I can't recommend more highly is 2,000 meters to Andreevka. But is it your methodology, those 400 plus case studies, that makes what you've published different from the countless other books out there about theories of combat and such, that you really look at it through the perspective of the infantryman? What sets you apart?
I mean, it's hard to answer that without sounding like I'm tooting my own horn, but yeah, I
Well, no,
mean,
you've got to. That's why
yeah,
we asked you on here. So,
sure. Okay. Thank you. No, yeah, I think that is. And to be as humble as possible about this, I'm not humble about the work because I'm proud of it and I worked
sure.
hard on it. But in terms of being right and wrong, I want to be as cautious as possible. So that's why it's completely transparent and publicly available. But yes, the data is what sets this apart, and there's really no comparison to what I've created, at least that I'm aware of in the public domain, with the exception of something called the database of battles that was created by the Depew, I'm going to pronounce that wrong, Institute,
Right,
and it was, I think the last battle was 19 in the late 1980s, so that's badly dated.
right.
Still a great comparative data set, but yeah, what understanding what actually happened and what is happening around the world is essential to characterizing what we think warfare is and then forecasting what we think it will be.
So tell us, what factors, what features dominate the modern battlefield today? For those infantrymen that are in Andriivka, in that documentary and countless other places in Ukraine, what is it that dominates the battlefield in their world?
There are a lot of things we can talk about here, including tanks and manned aircraft and so on and so forth. But
Right,
I'll compare and contrast too. So infantry and drones. Infantry are in every single case they're ubiquitous. There's a little bit of a risk of tautology there because of the requirements for a case, but infantry
right,
are always present. No ground was taken or held without infantry, and so that there's a continuing relevance of infantry in every single case of at least land warfare
right,
that I study. And then drones, you see this evolution of drones, and what appears to be a dramatic increase in drone use starting in about 2015, and then of course ramping up in Ukraine. But what I
right,
found by digging into the evidence was, in fact, that there was a growth in the public visibility of drone use because of YouTube, primarily because of the Islamic State and other groups publishing these things online. And in fact, if you look at the history of drone use, that it's been a very evolutionary kind of trend. There has been proliferation. So down at the local level, you see a lot more drone use,
right.
infantry drones, so on and so forth. But it hasn't changed the dynamics of the battlefield as much as we think. It has changed some things in on the front in Ukraine significantly. That is an isolated case with a lot of idiosyncratic factors that are important to understand. And we can't just necessarily extrapolate from what's happening, say, in, Andriivka, to anywhere else in the world.
Well, so we'll certainly jump a little bit deeper into Ukraine as we go on, but you know, if your thesis is correct, which I think there's a lot to point in that direction, what does that mean for force planners today? What should be their top priorities as they plan out their force structures for potential large scale conflict or conflict of any type over the next 10, 20, 30 years?
I've got a piece coming out for the NATO Defense College that gets to this point directly, and also another one for the British Army Review. And my argument here is that if you follow the data, the most important thing that you can develop is quality, high quality, motivated infantry. That
Right,
that does indeed fly in the face of the current kind of trend here, which is to get as many drones as we can into the
right.
hands of as many people as possible. This is not an anti-drone argument, and I think that's really difficult for people to process in this context, in this kind of environment we live in now, where everything is one way or the other. Everything's essentialist, right? You either love drones or hate drones. My argument is down the middle and saying, no, they're useful tools. But the thing that is going to allow us to hold and gain territory, which is still the primary objective, at least on land, is people with boots on their feet.
What is your ideal recipe for what makes a good infantry soldier? Right. I mean, I think the U.S. Army, Marines, or many of our NATO allies have that recipe down. But if you had to summarize it, it's probably not just making them technologically savvy, right? Is there some key tenets that are core to any training regimen for infantry soldiers?
Well, you're right. We do have the formula down, and this is something that we need to recognize of ourselves, and that we have over decades and over centuries. Really, if you go back to the development of infantry in the United Kingdom and other places, we've perfected this. Right, we have the formula down with a combination of intensive training people to be adaptable, which means giving them some leeway in addition to applying discipline, really high quality leadership and putting our leaders through both training and education programs, and then giving them the equipment they need to succeed. All of those things combine together to make good infantry. In terms of will to fight, all of those things, including cohesion, contribute to will. There are other factors, of course, that play into that as well. But we have to recognize that we're good at this, and we
Right.
have to recognize that we can create more infantry. I think the challenge we run into now is volume, right? And that is harder and harder because of cost, because of the willingness of civilians to commit to what is necessarily a difficult and dangerous life. It's increasingly difficult for the United States and for European powers to build large infantry formations, and we are convincing ourselves because of this kind of technological fantasy that we won't need them. And in fact, I argue that we will.
Do you view it as critical, though, for a young 18 or 19-year-old man or woman who's joining, the Marines or the Royal Marines or the French Army, that they, in this day and age, need to be technologically savvy? Or is that something that can be taught, further on in their career and their advanced training? Or, when they walk into boot camp on the first day, is it critical that they understand technology, understand drones and the criticality that they play on the battlefield? Or do you think it's more they just need to have the motivation and, the physical well-being and such?
Show me an 18-year-old that's not technologically savvy.
Right,
I'm
right,
not aware of too many. I'm not aware of any.
right,
They walk into boot camp with the ability to use screens and phones and video game controllers, and they actually design drones and other things to use. In some cases, actual video game controllers. I mean, this is not a high bar.
right,
And there are special schools for advanced technology use that have always existed in the military. They still exist. There's no reason to screen and recruit for people that have advanced technology skills for the entire force. That is a very narrow requirement. And we
right.
have to be careful not to extrapolate too far out. What we need are people who are motivated and physically resilient and tough and mentally resilient. And that physicality is something that's faded over the years. A lot of there are plenty of studies about the physical inadequacies of a lot of modern recruits, and so I would argue that physicality is actually one of the more important factors.
Sure. Well, if you just look at Ukraine, again, the amount of battlefield innovations there that have been driven by 19, 20, 21 year olds, right, who have seen a problem and brought out a minimum viable product in a matter of weeks and just using this sort of inherent understanding of technology and some engineering savvy. So I think you're absolutely right that 99.99% of infantry boot camp inductees will definitely know what to do with the technology that's in their future. What are the analytic traps that militaries and force planners in particular fall into? Specific assumptions or data habits or cultural biases that consistently lead these planners astray?
Yeah, I think the biggest one that we deal with now from a scientific perspective is convenience bias, and that we
Interesting.
are
Explain that, please. Yeah.
sure. I mean, we take the data that are available to us and then do what we can with those data. And
Right.
that is a terrible way to conduct research, because and if you actually look at, for example, polling and surveys, anybody that does a convenience sample, you can't be trusted. The data can't be trusted, right? So
Right. Right.
you don't want the answer from the easiest and most available information. And unfortunately, right now, the easiest and most available information is from drone feeds, because it's, almost every drone has a video camera
Right.
on it.
Right.
Um, and that's a scientific and academic failing. That has been a trend in academia for at least 20 or 30 years. Just kind of give me the data and I'll run it through something, instead of having people actually going out and collecting the information from the field. And we've cut way back on our field collection activities in not only the US military, but also in European militaries. And so the actual kind of tactile hands-on
Right.
first person observation stuff is generally absent. And so we become more vulnerable to just kind of like this passive online receipt of knowledge. And that is
Right.
a serious fallacy.
What does good field collection mean? Is that, after action interviews with participants, review of raw, unedited footage? What does good look like from the standpoint of your colleague, for example, who's in Ukraine as we speak?
Yeah, that's the purpose of the Battle Research Group, the central purpose of what we do. We're a nonprofit, but we obviously do funded research. We have folks out in the field. Our goal is to do what traditionally had been done by military historians. There are still people that do it. I mean, there's still military organizations that put people out into the war zones. But
Right.
again, they're fewer and fewer. And just very briefly before I get into what James Sladden is doing at the moment, um, the Army didn't have a historian in Afghanistan after 2014, at least according to one report. I mean,
Wow.
there was nobody. Yeah, that's profound, right? We've pretty much given up on the idea of military history in the United States as history. So what we do is we get folks out into the field. They walk the battleground. They interview people. And they go back over and over again and re-interview and build trust and gain access to more people. And what you find is that the story evolves in unexpected ways, and the things that you assumed at the outset, and that are, by the way, these assumptions that are then baked into policy
Right.
later, turn out not to be true. And you gain greater fidelity by physically being there, and most importantly, by listening to people. And you can only do that by physical presence.
Well, that point you made about the lack of focus on military history and lessons learned, longer term lessons learned. So, would you say that the kind of standard assumption that the U.S. military is a wonderful learning organization, it may not be the case like it was, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago, or is that an overstatement?
It's a slight overstatement because young officers are still hungry to learn.
Right.
And young enlisted folks they still want this information. But if you look, even just do a surface check online and look at the Marine Corps History Division and the Army's Center of Military History publications, our understanding of even the wars in which we have fought in the 21st century is at least in the public domain, really thin. And
Right.
I can tell you a lot of that information is locked up in classified servers and nobody's just gotten around to releasing it.
Sure.
Um, yeah, we just don't have the information there to feed that knowledge. And so the functions of learning are still somewhat there, but the information to make that learning valuable and useful and to connect it to present reality is certainly lacking.
Interesting. You write a lot about, and this probably isn't surprising with the argument that you make, you write a lot about the stubborn physical and psychological realities of ground combat. And again, like the documentary certainly highlights, this is friction, misperception, exhaustion. Why do you believe that these persist? Or is this just core to the very essence of ground combat? And no matter what technology comes out, that they will always be there. Is that the case? Or again, an overstatement?
No, it's not an overstatement. The evidence shows that that is the case. And, I mean, certainly someone could dispute the evidence if they want to, and it's all there publicly online for them to do so. But this is all unremitting. I mean, this is if you want to fight and kill people, the people that you're fighting against and trying to kill don't want to die in most cases, and they're going to do
Sure.
everything they can to stop you. And what that often boils down to is a knife fight or a gunfight, and um, that's how war is. There's this kind of lingering idea, and it's mistaken that Karl von Clausewitz, who wrote
Right.
On War, said that there's a constant, a permanent, unchanging nature and a constantly changing character of war. And in fact, he never actually said that in those terms. War may be, an extension of policy, by other means. At the very high level, kind of conceptual level, maybe there is in nature, but at the
Right.
practical level, that has never bore out. And what I argue also in the book is that there's no such thing as the character of war, and that's a junk phrase that we use because we don't have a good stand-in for it.
Right. Good
Uh,
soundbite.
yeah, it's a soundbite. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so just speaking of Clausewitz, I guess you can't have a conversation like this without mentioning his name. Were there other sort of iconoclasts and such in military history over the past 100 odd years that you look to who were asking the same questions that you are? Who did you draw inspiration from?
Sure, Colin Gray, Stephen Biddle, Elliot
Right.
Cohen, and I think Biddle and Gray in particular, Gray for pushing back in a very
Hmm.
thoughtful and intellectual way against the revolution of military affairs, and then Stephen Biddle for his 2004 work, and by the way, he just updated it with an article I think last year,
Oh, great.
Military Power, which I recommend to people. And Biddle gets into the same questions that I do. And I wrote the book in at least in part in response to Biddle's call for better studies.
Mhm.
And he basically say this same thing I'm saying, that we just done a terrible job trying to understand what's actually happening in war.
And we'll put some of their names in the show notes as well. But let's go back to Ukraine. What about the war has surprised you, and has it pushed you to revise any elements of your original thesis?
I have some strategic perspectives on that I'll probably keep to myself here, but
Sure.
from a tactical perspective, nothing has surprised me, and this is how war tends to go. You have, an initial phase of the fight where everybody brings the military forces that they have on hand. I can't say that I predicted the Ukrainians succeeding, but I'm glad they did in the initial phase of the
You're
war.
not alone in that original assumption, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's if I had to pick a surprise, I think that would be it. I'd like to pretend I knew that they were gonna succeed, but, yeah, I can't do that. So, I'm glad they did again, but everything that followed after that has been no surprise at all because this is a long-standing trend. You see, fighting, it changes in the way its local characterizations over time, and then you see adaptability. And both sides in this case are adapting. And that if you look at every single war throughout history, the sides that adapt are generally successful or can at least
Right.
survive in most cases. And in this case, both sides are doing that, and so you see a grinding style of warfare and attrition because of that. If one side had failed to adapt, I think you would have seen a much more lopsided conflict at this point.
Going back to the initial response to in the full scale invasion back in February of 2022, what would you attribute that to? Was it with the sheer revulsion at the idea of a Russian takeover?
So we're learning more and more about this that each time James goes forward and interviews folks, and of course we're learning from other people as well who are out there doing research.
Right.
Bob Hamilton and Rob Lee and Mike
Sure.
Coffman and
Right.
so forth. Right? I mean, all
Right.
those folks are fairly well known.
Great commentators.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And there are other researchers too, Alex Chinchilla and others that probably don't get as much play. But what we're finding is that there was some planning. There was certainly good planning ahead of time. There was some preparation by certain units that was essential to success, and we'll publish more on that later. But
Right.
what was really remarkable was the kind of national surge in volunteerism that
Right.
probably made the difference. And you had people just running to the front lines as fast as they could. So this was a national defense of the Ukrainian state, of the Ukrainian nation. And it really speaks volumes to the sense of Ukrainian nationalism.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And then coupling that with, would you classify it as, sheer incompetence that went into the Russian planning for at least those first 3 or 4 months?
That's an interesting question. It is a combination of incompetence, arrogance, and bad assumptions. And part of that is the FSB, the Russian security service assessment that failed to convince Vladimir Putin, or they basically didn't take the risk to try to convince him that the Ukrainians might actually fight.
Right.
And so the Russian planning was based on the assumption that they wouldn't have to fight. And so if the Russians had gone in as they normally fight, which would be to mass their artillery and aerial fires, to smash everything in front of them, and to roll masses of infantry and armor then into the objective areas. it might have been a different outcome.
To that point, it reminds me of a conversation I had earlier this year in Kyiv. I was chatting with a retired Royal Marine officer. We were looking out over the city. We're kind of one of the higher points in the city. And you have this great vista, and just you got a sense of the sheer size of Kyiv. And he made the very poignant remark of how could the Russians have ever thought that they could hold this city? And I think the only assumption is that they thought that they would be welcomed as liberators. But like you say, just the unbelievable intelligence failure around how the Russians thought the Ukrainians would respond.
Yeah, the easiest way to lose a war is to quit, like in sports, right? And so, you know, if you can take a city that size, if everybody in the city fails to fight. I mean, look at Paris,
Of
uh,
course,
right? So, um, yeah, but if people are fighting, that kind of urban operation becomes extraordinarily challenging.
just a Stalingrad style meat grinder.
Yeah,
Um,
that happened in places like Bakhmut, which is tiny by
Yes, of course, right. Well, let's shift a little bit east to China. You know, a huge amount of it seems like the only commentary about a US-China conflict, specifically around Taiwan, is focused on just how the fact that it will absolutely be dominated by advanced technology, hypersonic missiles, cyber effects. What does your research tell you about that, and what does maybe your gut tell you about that?
I think that's accurate in the early phases of a prospective conflict. You know, I can't remember. I'm flagging on the quote here, but it was something along the lines of, you know, when all the missiles and bombs are used up, we'll be fighting with sticks. So, at, the issue here is of magazine depth and the expectation for a short war versus the realities of a long war. And so, if we actually come to blows over Taiwan, it is broadly recognized, it has been war gamed, it has been calculated, even in the public domain, that both sides run out of the advanced missiles in fairly short order. The question then is how much damage can be done with that technology in the very short period of time that they have before they run out. And so if the Chinese sink, you know, the vast majority of US naval vessels and shoot down most of our F-35s and 22s,
Right,
uh, you know, I don't know how we stay in the fight after that.
right.
And but if we're able to sustain and our capabilities and stay in the fight, then you have to start thinking about what that looks like. And I think probably less thought has gone into an attenuated war against the Chinese in and around Taiwan than a kind of initial strike analysis. And that's not saying it's not happening. I've been part of those conversations in the Pentagon, so people are thinking about it. It's a much more difficult analytic challenge.
So it's not just a question of magazine depth and logistics, but that's what will dominate the first week or two of any sort of conflict.
Yeah, and we're
Uh,
at a disadvantage, right? Because we're fighting in the Chinese backyard, and their magazine depth is going to be much greater than ours.
so as we kind of approach the end here, if senior decision makers in Washington, Brussels, etc., would ask you for the one piece of advice that you could give them to avoid strategic miscalculations and future conflict with a technologically sophisticated adversary, what would you tell them?
I would tell them that they need to do the hard work to gather the information to understand what the present realities of war actually are. And because if you're going to forecast, you know, this is very kind of traditional, hardcore, old school forecasting theory and methodology.
Right.
Understand the past and the present in order to forecast the future. And we can do a better job of that with modest resources.
Right. But you're would you say that they do have the absolutely core deliverable of how do you train a solid infantry
Oh,
soldier?
in
Uh,
terms of what the physical capability is, yeah, we have that is at least for land warfare, that's always going to be the core capability. And you could, you know, extrapolate that out to the Navy and the, you know, broader question here we don't have time for, but something for people to consider as we end here is the difference between exquisite and few pieces of advanced capability like advanced shipping
right.
versus less exquisite but more numerous and unfortunately more disposable equipment like we had in the past.
Right. And so you would say that there should be more thought given to the latter, to the less exquisite, higher volume, as opposed to the $100 million plus systems.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean just drones that you can shoot at people. It means, unfortunately, ships that are going to be less survivable.
Right.
And there's that's a tough calculation these days with risk aversion and casualty aversion. Look, that I'm amenable to those arguments as well. But in the reality of war, if you lose volume and mass, you are at a disadvantage.
Right. And on that point, stepping away from the US military's trainings, would you say that NATO members tend to follow the same general playbook in terms of how they are training young men and women as infantry soldiers, that their quality is also very high, obviously with some differences?
With significant differences, I think, across different NATO member states. I mean, the British are probably the next to the Americans, or at least they might even be better. Who knows? But
Right.
they're right up there. The French are really good, and then other countries have challenges. I mean, there are others obviously that are really good as well,
Right.
and that don't have the same traditions or focus. And so, I think some effort needs to be made by NATO as an alliance to help its member states perhaps elevate their infantry capabilities.
Well, I guess that's the very essence of not exquisite, but absolutely critical. It's just knowing how to turn an 18-year-old into a soldier. Last question. We always close with reading recommendations, and what our listeners should put on their nightstand if they want to go a little bit deeper into this. And what would be 1 to 2 books that you would say would be absolutely critical for somebody who really wants to understand the themes of ground combat, or some of the theorists that you drew inspiration from, or just maybe some of the good memoirs that really capture what you're trying to describe?
Give you one answer to bring home the kind of grinding reality of warfare. And it's a tough read, but it's worthwhile. And it's Hell in a Very Small Place, The Siege of Dien Bien Phu by Bernard Fall. And that really, I mean, that is probably the single best battle study ever written, arguably.
Sure.
And it drags you into the intimate details of ground combat in ways that the French did not expect. And I think that we need to continue to consider over time.
That is an absolutely top tier recommendation. So, Hell in a Very Small Place by Bernard Fall. We haven't mentioned his name yet so far on the podcast, but I'm glad that he made it into this episode. So, well, Ben, thank you so much for joining us today. Ben Connable's book, Ground Combat: Puncturing the Myths of Modern War, was published by Georgetown University Press and is widely available. And as you can certainly tell from our conversation, is well worth reading for anyone interested in the hard truths of ground combat and modern war. So, Ben, thank you very much for joining us, my friend.
Thanks for having me on, Todd.